My name is Prute Taylor Vince, and I'm 72 years old. I need to tell you something that I've been carrying around for the better part of 6 years now. Not as a grudge, though God knows I was angry enough in those first months to carry one for the rest of my natural life, but as a story, as something real that happened, and something that still matters, even though most people would tell me I should be over it by now. My name is Prute Taylor Vince, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, I've been the kind of man who didn't say much. I worked with my hands, construction, carpentry, renovation work mostly, and I let the work speak. I showed up early, stayed late, did the job right, and didn't complain. I came home to a woman I loved, raised a son I was proud of, and thought I understood what my life was going to look like when it ended. Then, on a Tuesday evening in March of 2019, I overheard a conversation in my son's kitchen that changed everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most in the world. Here's the one sentence that contains the entire collapse. My son's fiancée, a woman I had welcomed into our family, a woman whose wedding I'd already planned to pay for, looked at my wife and said, "We're thinking about having the wedding in Colorado. Maybe a destination wedding. It'll be easier without having to worry about." Well, you know. And when I followed my wife's confused silence into that kitchen, I saw them both looking at me with a smile that suggested I'd been written out of the scene before the first draft was even finished. Let me be precise about what I'm telling you. I wasn't just being excluded from a wedding. I was being discussed as the kind of obstacle that required strategic planning, as a problem to be managed, as the thing that had to be worried about. The person who hurt me most wasn't the fiancée, though God knows I have plenty of thoughts about her later. It was my wife. Because when I asked her about it that night, after everyone had gone home, she looked at the television and said, "It's probably for the best, Prute." And when I pressed her on what that meant, she left the room and never came back to the conversation. Not that night, not the next morning, not ever. Before I tell you how I survived this, before I tell you what I did about it, and before I tell you how it all came apart and came back together in ways I never could have anticipated, I need you to understand who I was before that Tuesday evening. Because the man who overheard that conversation wasn't the same man who started out in this story, and the distance between those two people is the entire point. Part 1. The Invisible Years. I grew up in Nebraska in a small town that's probably smaller now than it was then. My father worked in grain processing. My mother cleaned houses and took in sewing. I was the youngest of four, 3 older sisters and me, and I was, for all intents and purposes, the forgotten one. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would have justified family therapy or made for a good story at the time. Just the simple, practical way that happens in working families where resources are stretched thin and attention follows the money. My oldest sister, Margaret, was beautiful and got married at 18. My middle sister, Patricia, was smart and went to college on a scholarship. My youngest older sister, Catherine, was musical and played in the school orchestra. And then there was Prute, who was okay at some things, not great at anything, not terrible at anything, just persistent. I learned early that if you wanted attention in that house, you either had to be exceptional or you had to create a crisis. Since I wasn't exceptional, I stopped trying to be noticed. Instead, I became the one who fixed things. I was the one who could figure out how the plumbing worked, who could patch the roof, who could make something broken functional again without asking for help. I was 12 years old when I rebuilt my father's work boots by hand, resoled them, stitched them back together, made them wearable again when my parents couldn't afford new ones. He wore them for another 2 years, and in all that time, he never once asked me how I'd done it. He was just grateful they still worked. I was 14 when I built a small addition to the back of the house, nothing fancy, just a mudroom so we wouldn't track dirt into the kitchen. I did the framing, the rough carpentry, helped my father with some of the plumbing, sealed it up as well as I could with the resources we had. My mother used it. Every day of my teenage years and for the rest of her life, she walked through that mudroom I built. And in all that time, she asked me maybe twice what I'd done and how I'd done it. I wasn't lonely. That's not the right word. I had friends. I was on the high school basketball team, not as a starter, but I played. I had girls interested in me, though nothing serious. I went to dances and football games and did all the things that teenagers in small Nebraska towns did in the 1960s. But there was a particular feeling, a kind of weather that moved through my childhood, that I was essentially interchangeable with the furniture. Important to the function of the household, but not important to anyone's internal life. This is not a story about neglect. This is not a story about cruelty. This is a story about what happens when a child learns early that his existence is practical rather than precious, that his value is in what he can do, not in who he is. I think this matters because it sets up the rest of it. Because if you understand what it feels like to be invisible in the house where you live, you'll understand why the hope, when it finally came, felt so enormous that it nearly broke me when it was taken away. The summer I turned 17, my father was diagnosed with heart disease. This wasn't a complete surprise. He'd been short of breath for months, making trips to the doctor, getting test results that he didn't like to talk about. But when the diagnosis came back officially, it changed something in the way my family moved through the house. For the first time that I could remember, my presence became valuable in a way that wasn't about what I could build or fix. It was about what I could be: steady, present, dependable. My father couldn't do heavy work anymore. I took over, and not just the projects around the house. I started going out on jobs with him in the summers, working construction alongside the men he'd contracted work for. And I was good at it. Not just competent, actually good. I was strong and precise. I picked things up quickly. I could look at a problem and see the solution without having to ask. I could work 12 hours and come back the next day ready to work another 12. By the time I was 19, I had a reputation in that small town. People asked for me specifically. Men wanted me on their crews. And my father noticed. This is the precise moment I want to stay with, because it's the moment that everything hung in a different balance. One afternoon, we were working on the renovation of a barn about 15 miles outside of town, and there was a complicated structural issue with the way the original builders had set up the supports. The owner was standing there, worried about costs, worried about whether it could even be fixed, and my father turned to me, not to the general contractor, not to the architect they'd hired. He turned to me and said, "What do you think, Prout?" I was 19 years old. I worked it out. And the whole time I was working it out, I could feel my father watching me. And I could feel something shift in his chest, some recognition that maybe his youngest son had become someone worth paying attention to. That week, he told my mother that I had a real gift for the work, that I should probably skip college and go into contracting myself. He said it like he'd discovered something surprising in me, like I'd been a rough stone, and now there was a light coming through. For the first time in my conscious memory, I wasn't just useful, I was seen. I married Ellen when I was 23. She was a math teacher, the first person in her family to finish college, and she was smart in a way that made me feel like I'd won something I didn't know I was entering a contest to win. She was kind. She was steady. She had her own life, her own accomplishments, and she chose me anyway. We bought a house. I started my own contracting business. Ellen taught high school. My father lived long enough to see the business get established. He died at 58, not quite a decade after his heart disease diagnosis. But in that decade, he saw me build something, and I know for a fact that he was proud. He told me so. In the hospital a few days before he died, he held my hand and said, "You turned out all right, Prout. You turned out just fine." Those are the words I held on to when everything else came apart. Ellen and I had our son, Daniel, when I was 25. He was everything I didn't know I was supposed to want: curious, verbal, charming. Where I was quiet, he was talkative. Where I solved problems with my hands, he solved them with words. He was like Ellen, that kind of quick, verbal intelligence that made conversations feel like sparring matches that no one was keeping score in. I loved him completely. I also had no idea how to be his father. How do you guide someone who doesn't think like you? How do you teach someone to value silence and work when they're most alive in conversation and chaos? I did the best I could. I took him to job sites when he was old enough. I tried to teach him about construction, about the satisfaction of building something that lasted. He was interested in it the way kids are interested in their parents' work sometimes, curious enough to visit, but not enough to actually care. He wanted other things. He wanted to travel, to go to college in a big city, to be a lawyer or a politician or something that involved making arguments and winning debates. Every time he expressed these ambitions, Ellen and I would support him. And I meant it. I wanted him to have the advantages I didn't. I wanted him to be able to use his mind in whatever way he wanted to use it. But there's a small lie that sits underneath all of that parental support sometimes. And for me, it was this. I also wanted him to be like me in the ways that mattered. I wanted him to be quiet and dependable and satisfied with a job well done. I wanted him to value solidity over ambition. He didn't. And by the time he was a teenager, I think he knew that I was disappointed about that, even though I did everything I could to hide it. This is another piece that I need to say plainly, because it matters to the rest of the story. I raised my son in a way that made him understand that his primary value to me was conditioned on being the kind of person I wanted him to be. And when he grew into a different kind of person, I loved him anyway, but I don't think I ever convinced him that I wasn't keeping score. Daniel went to UCLA. He got a degree in economics. He moved to California and didn't move back. He built a life that looked nothing like the life I had built, and he was successful at it. By the time he was 30, he was working in finance, making more money in a year than I'd made in 5, living in a beautiful house in the hills, dating women who were everything my wife had been when she was young, smart, accomplished, pretty in a way that suggested they'd never had to wonder if they were worth paying attention to. I was proud of him. I was also deeply aware that he didn't need me the way the children of failed men sometimes need their fathers. He needed advice about mortgage rates, not carpentry. He needed to be asked about his work, not his life. He needed to be seen as an adult equal, not as a boy his father was still trying to steer toward a particular path. Ellen and I would visit twice a year. We'd stay in a hotel. He was never going to offer the spare bedroom, and we weren't going to ask. And we'd spend 4 days eating in restaurants where I didn't recognize most of the menu items. Ellen loved these trips. She'd ask him questions about his job, about economics, about the systems that moved money around the world. He would explain and explain and explain. In the patient way, you explain things to someone you know won't quite understand, but who is genuinely trying. I would sit at the table and eat, and try not to think about how little I had to contribute to these conversations. And then Daniel met Caitlin. Caitlin was beautiful in an effortless way, the kind of beautiful that suggests she'd never had to think about being beautiful. She was a lawyer. She came from money. She was, quite literally, everything that Daniel's career trajectory had been designed to lead toward. I have no reason to believe she was a bad person. In fact, from what I saw in those early years, she seemed perfectly pleasant, charming. She paid attention to Ellen. She asked about my construction business with the kind of polite interest you ask an elderly uncle about his hobbies. She and Daniel looked like a picture of what success looks like when it's constructed by people who have never had to doubt their own success. My wife loved her. Ellen would call me after we'd visited and tell me how relieved she was that Daniel had found someone stable. And I understood what that meant. It meant someone who wasn't going to pull him back toward anything that looked like Nebraska. Someone who was going to keep him moving forward into whatever came next. Daniel proposed to her in December of 2018. They were getting married in June of 2019. And for about 3 months, I went through the motions of being happy about it. I helped with planning. I offered to contribute to costs. I told my son that I was looking forward to the wedding. And then, in March, everything crystallized into the moment that broke open everything else. Part 2, the knife turns. Let me be specific about the day because precision matters here. It was Tuesday, March 19th, 2019. A cool March afternoon, the kind where Nebraska is finally starting to release its grip on winter but hasn't quite committed to spring. Ellen and I had driven up to Lincoln to have lunch with Daniel at some restaurant downtown. After lunch, he'd invited us to come back to the house he and Caitlin had just bought together. The house was perfect in the way that houses are perfect when two successful people have just bought one together and decorated it with the help of people who knew what they were doing. Everything matched. Nothing looked lived in. It was the kind of house that made me feel like I needed to take my shoes off the moment I entered, even though no one had asked me to. We walked through it while Daniel pointed out renovations they were planning, which meant that I was finally useful in a conversation. I could talk about drywall and flooring and HVAC systems. I could give suggestions. I could make myself matter. And Daniel, to his credit, listened. He asked my opinion on a few things. He seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Then Ellen needed to use the bathroom. Daniel took me into the backyard to show me the deck he wanted to build. Caitlin stayed inside. Or that's what I thought. But Caitlin was still in the kitchen, and Ellen's path to the bathroom took her through the kitchen, and somehow Ellen lingered there, and somehow I heard them talking when I came back inside to get a drink of water. The voices were low. They thought they were alone, and Caitlin was talking about the wedding. His father is so, she was saying, and I had already stopped moving, already felt the air change. Quiet, Caitlin was offering, and I heard my wife laugh. Actually laugh, in a way I realized I hadn't heard her laugh in years. Awkward, Caitlin said. He doesn't seem to know what to do with himself at events, and he drinks too much at parties. I should tell you, I don't drink much. I've never been a drinker. I've probably had 6 drinks in the last 5 years, and that includes wine at dinner and beer at football games. But this was not a fact that would interrupt the narrative Caitlin was constructing, which seemed to be the whole point. We're thinking about having the wedding in Colorado, Caitlin was saying. Maybe a destination wedding, just close family. It'll be easier without having to worry about. And here she paused, and that pause was the knife going in, without having to manage him. And my wife, my Ellen of 47 years, said, "It's probably for the best. Prute's never been comfortable at big events. It would stress him out." Manage. The word fell between them like it had weight, like I was a difficult house guest instead of a father, a project instead of a person. I stood there in the hallway of my son's kitchen, my hand on the water glass I'd never quite filled, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. First, there was just a kind of confusion, a sense of standing outside my own life and trying to understand the plot. And then anger. And then something worse than anger, which is the kind of clarity that comes when you realize the people you've built your entire life around have been politely, carefully planning you out of it. I don't remember going into the kitchen. I must have, because I was suddenly there, and they both looked up at me with the expressions of children caught doing something they shouldn't, which is to say they looked guilty but also slightly defiant. Caitlin's smile didn't falter. Ellen's did something more painful. It froze, like a smile you'd make in a photograph and can't quite get to drop. "Prute," Ellen said, in the voice she used when she was about to explain something that couldn't be explained. "We were just." "Don't," I said, and I said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if I'd yelled. "Just don't." I left the house. I got in the truck. I sat in the driveway for a long time before I drove anywhere, trying to decide what to do with the information I'd just gathered, trying to decide who I was now that I had it. I drove home alone. Ellen called my phone 4 times on the drive back to Omaha. I didn't answer any of them. I drove with the windows down even though it was cold, trying to remember the last time I'd felt like I was actually part of the family I'd built, trying to understand when I'd become a person who needed to be managed at events. When I got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time. The house where Ellen and I had raised Daniel. The house I'd built onto, modified, improved, rebuilt from the inside out. The house that had become, over 47 years, a kind of monument to the relationship we had. And I sat in that driveway and tried to decide what to do about the fact that my wife had been discussing strategies to exclude me from my own son's wedding. Not because I couldn't afford it. Not because there was some practical reason. But because I was awkward, because I made her uncomfortable. Ellen got home about 2 hours later. She pulled in beside me, but she didn't get out of her car. We sat there in the driveway, two people in two separate vehicles, and I could see her crying through her windshield, which somehow made it worse. Finally, I got out and walked to her car. She rolled down the window. "Explain it to me," I said. "Prue, you have to understand." "No," I said, "I don't explain it to me anyway." And Ellen, my wife, the woman I had chosen above all other people, the woman I had worked 47 years to provide for and build a life with, tried. She tried to explain that Caitlin was just anxious about the wedding, that she hadn't meant anything serious, that destination weddings were trendy right now, and actually, it might be nice, less stress, fewer people. "You want fewer people there because I stress you out," I said. "That's not what I said." "No, it's what Caitlin said, and you laughed, and then you agreed with her. You said it would be for the best." "I don't remember saying exactly." "You remember," I said. "You just don't want to own it." Ellen started crying. Not quiet crying. The kind of crying that suggested she was more sad about being caught than about what she'd done, though I'm probably not being fair in that assessment. I was angry enough that fair wasn't really my priority. "I won't go," I said. "Prude. I won't go to the wedding, you're right. It would be better if I wasn't there. Easier, less to manage, so I won't go." "That's not what I want," Ellen said. "No, but it's what you wanted enough to plan around me, so I'm making it easy for you." I went inside. She stayed outside for a long time, sitting in her car in the driveway like she was waiting for permission to come in. Here's what I did after that conversation. I went back to my work. I had 2 renovation projects running that spring, a master bath renovation in Elkhorn and a kitchen remodel in Westside. I threw myself into both of them with the kind of intensity that I usually saved for projects where something was at stake. I worked 12, 13, 14-hour days. I came home after Ellen had gone to bed. I left before she woke up. I'm not saying this was mature. I'm saying this was what I did with rage and betrayal when I wasn't ready to blow up the marriage but wasn't ready to fix it either. Ellen tried. I'll give her that. She tried to talk to me. I wasn't interested in talking. She tried to apologize. I wasn't interested in apologies because I wasn't actually sure what she was apologizing for. Was she apologizing for what she'd said, or apologizing for getting caught saying it? Daniel called. I didn't answer. He left messages on my voicemail about the wedding, about wanting to know if we were going, about wanting to talk about it. I listened to these messages and felt something in me close off, like a door shutting. I was not yet done being angry, which means I was not ready for conversation. The anger lasted about 6 weeks. Let me be specific about what anger like that feels like when you're 70 years old and you've been quiet most of your life. It's like something carbonated, like pressure building up in a sealed container, like if you don't find a way to release it, it's going to explode and take everything around it with it. I called my son on a Saturday morning in May. Ellen was at her book club. I wanted to call him when she wasn't there to monitor the conversation, to manage it, the way she was managing so many other things. "Dad," he said when he picked up, "I've been waiting for you to call." "I'm not going to the wedding," I said. There was a long silence. "Because of what happened," I said. Because of what your fiancé said and what your mother did. Dad, I don't know what you're talking about. And this is the moment I should have paused. The moment I should have thought about the possibility that Daniel had not been part of that conversation, that he had not known what Caitlin was planning to do, what my wife had been agreeing with. But I was too angry to pause. I told him, word for word, what I'd overheard, what his mother had said, what his fiancé had said. I told him that I'd been dismissed, demoted, decided upon without being consulted. That was about logistics, Daniel said, not about you. We can do a big wedding or we can do a small wedding. Caitlin prefers small. We want you there. I want you there. Your mother thinks I'd be a problem, I said. Your fiancé thinks I'm awkward and drunk and need to be managed. That's not fair, Daniel said. That's exactly what I heard, I said. Well, maybe you misunderstood, Daniel said. And this was the thing that actually tipped me into something beyond anger. Not because he was wrong, but because I could hear in his voice that he was going to take his fiancé's side. That he was going to decide that I had misunderstood, that I was overreacting, that I was the problem in this scenario. I'm not going to the wedding, I said again, and I'm not going to apologize for that or explain it anymore. I hung up, and then I turned off my phone. It took Ellen 3 days to find out what had happened. Daniel called the house phone. Ellen got the message. That evening she came to the bedroom where I was reading. We'd graduated to not sleeping in the same room a few nights earlier, though we hadn't acknowledged it, and she sat on the edge of the bed. You told him you're not coming, she said. Yes. That was cruel. It was honest, I said. It was cruel, Ellen repeated, as though honesty and cruelty weren't sometimes the same thing. He's devastated. He thinks you don't love him. I love him, I said, but I'm not going to pretend to be fine with being dismissed. No one's dismissing you. That's not true, Ellen. You are. You've been doing it for years and I've just been quiet about it, but I noticed. I've been noticing. Ellen left the room. We didn't speak about it again. Not really. She would try a few times over the next months, but I would shut down the conversation. I would leave the room. I would find projects that kept me too busy or too tired for the kind of emotional excavation that actual repair would have required. This is the part where I need to be honest about something. I handled the situation badly. Not in the way that matters to the moral outcome of this story, but in the practical way. I let my hurt turn into punishment. I let the opportunity for understanding turn into a line drawn in the sand. I told myself I was protecting myself. What I was actually doing was protecting the wound. I was keeping it open so it wouldn't start to heal and make me forget why I had a right to be angry. The wedding was scheduled for June 15th. It was, in the end, a small wedding, about 60 people, in Colorado at a resort near Aspen. Exactly the destination wedding that Caitlin had wanted, the wedding that wouldn't require managing me or worrying about my comfort. Ellen went. She bought a new dress. She had her hair done. She came to say goodbye to me the morning she left, and we both knew that this wasn't just a trip to Colorado for a wedding. This was something else. This was the beginning of something that would require a lot of deconstruction before it could be reconstructed. I'm sorry, Ellen said in the doorway. For what? I said. For all of it. And it wasn't enough, because I wasn't sure what all of it meant. Did she mean she was sorry for what she'd said, or sorry for getting caught? Or sorry for having thought the things she'd said in the first place? I know, I said anyway. She was gone for a week. The house felt bigger when she was away. I noticed things I hadn't noticed while she was there. The way the light came through the kitchen windows in the morning, the way the house settled around me at night. I realized that I'd been living in this space for 47 years, and I'd somehow become a ghost in it. She came home from the wedding with pictures. Daniel and Caitlin looked genuinely happy. Ellen looked like she'd been crying, but also like she'd been fine. Like she'd moved forward while I'd stayed in place. He missed you, Ellen said, showing me the pictures. I didn't respond. He talked about you, about wanting to fix things. Then he should have called me. He should have said something to Caitlin. He did, Ellen said. He and Caitlin had a fight about it. She cried. He felt terrible. This should have been the moment where something in me softened, where I understood that my son loved me and had been caught between his fiancée and his father, and had chosen, in the moment, to move forward rather than pick sides. It should have been the moment where I recognized that I'd been the one making the choice to punish him. But I was still too angry, and my anger had calcified into something harder, something that looked like principle but was really just protection. That's his situation to deal with, I said. Ellen looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her making some kind of decision about me, about us, about what came next. We need to talk, she said. I don't want to talk. I know, but we need to anyway. We didn't talk that day, or the next day, or for several months. We moved through the house like we were performing a life together without actually living one. I would wake up early and leave before she got up. I would come home late and go straight to the bedroom. On weekends, I would find projects that kept me busy outside the house. Ellen threw herself into her book club, her bridge group, her volunteer work at the library. She made a life that didn't require me to be there. And I let her. I more than let her. I encouraged it by being as absent as possible, by making it clear that I wasn't interested in being part of whatever life she was building. This is a very long way to say. We were both checking out, and we were both pretending we weren't. Daniel called occasionally. These calls were awkward and strained. We'd talk about his work, about projects I was working on, about anything that wasn't the real thing we needed to talk about. After a few minutes, we'd run out of safe topics, and one of us would say we had to go. We hung up knowing we'd made no progress and weren't going to. Caitlin called once. She was trying to smooth things over, trying to make peace. I was cordial but distant. She must have understood that I was never going to forgive her for calling me awkward, and for suggesting that I needed to be managed like a difficult houseguest. But there wasn't anything she could do about it. So we just moved through that conversation like two people who had agreed to pretend the other didn't exist. Summer turned to fall. Fall turned to winter. And I realized that I'd been angry for so long that I'd lost the thing I was angry about. The anger had become the point. The anger was the story. Everything else had been subsumed into this one central fact. I had been dismissed, and I was not going to let anyone forget it. This is not a position that I'm proud of, but it's the position I occupied, and I want to be honest about it, because it matters to understanding how much damage a man can do to himself, and the people he loves when he decides that being right is more important than being connected. It was Thanksgiving when Ellen finally said something I couldn't dismiss or ignore. Daniel and Caitlin were coming to stay for the weekend. Ellen had planned a small dinner, just the four of us. She'd mentioned it in passing a few days earlier, and I'd said I'd be working on a project in the basement. She said nothing about this. She just nodded and made the dinner plans anyway. The day before Thanksgiving, she came and stood in the doorway of the workshop I'd converted the basement into. I was working on a cabinet, a project I'd started in September and had no real urgency to finish. "They're arriving at 2 o'clock tomorrow," Ellen said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't disappear into the basement." "I don't know what you want from me," I said, not looking up from my work. "I want my husband back," she said. "I want my family back. I want something that looks like a life instead of this, whatever this is." "This is what you get," I said, "when you decide to exclude someone from their own family's events." "I didn't exclude you. Caitlin wanted a small wedding. And you were happy to help her make that happen." "I was trying to make the best of a situation that wasn't perfect," Ellen said. "And you've been punishing all of us for it for 8 months." "I'm not punishing anyone. You're not talking to your son. You're not sleeping in our bedroom. You're not talking to me. How is that not punishment?" I still didn't look at her. I was running my hand over the wood I was working with, feeling for the grain, finding the places where the wood wanted to split and the places where it wanted to hold together. "I can't do this anymore," Ellen said quietly, "and I don't think I want to." This is the moment where you can hear the story changing direction, where something that was always going to be a conflict becomes something that's going to become an ending. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying that I'm going to divorce you if things don't change radically and very soon." She said this in the quiet way that you say things that are true and terrible, like she was reading a grocery list, like it wasn't the most frightening thing anyone had ever said to me. I finally looked up at her. "You'd really do that?" "Yes," she said, "because I can't live like this, and I won't spend the last decades of my life being punished by someone I love." Then she left, and I sat there in the basement with a piece of wood in my hands, and the understanding that I had somehow managed to turn a betrayal that had nothing to do with me into a situation where I was actually the villain. I didn't hide in the basement on Thanksgiving. Ellen hadn't asked me to promise that I wouldn't. She just told her truth and let me make my own decision. And I realized that I'd been given a choice. I could keep being right, or I could start trying to fix things. They arrived at 2 o'clock. I was in the kitchen with Ellen when Daniel and Caitlin pulled up. Ellen shot me a look that said, "Don't disappear," and I nodded. We did Thanksgiving the way we'd done it for the past 40 years. Turkey, stuffing, the whole complicated dance of a family dinner. But this time, there was a weight to it. We were all aware that we were performing instead of living. We were going through the motions of family the way you go through the motions of something you're not sure you believe in anymore. After dinner, while Ellen and Caitlin cleaned up in the kitchen, Daniel and I sat in the living room. The football game was on. Neither of us was watching it very carefully. "Mom says you might not want to see me," Daniel said eventually. "That's not true," I said, and it wasn't. I did want to see him. I just didn't know how to do it without the anger being between us. "Then I don't understand what's happening," Daniel said. And I realized he genuinely didn't. Or maybe he did, but he was hoping I would explain it in a way that made sense, in a way that didn't require him to take sides. "Your mother said things to your fiancé about me," I said, "and she agreed with them, and they made plans based on those things. And you've been angry about it for 8 months. "Yes. And now you're punishing all of us." "I'm not," I started, and then I stopped, because that's exactly what I'd been doing. "Dad, I didn't know what they were saying, and when I found out, I pushed back on Caitlin. We fought about it. But I was also trying to plan a wedding, and I was trying to keep everyone happy, and I failed at all of it. I wanted to tell him that he should have called me, that he should have made it clear that he wanted me there. But these things weren't what he needed to hear. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" "For making my hurt your responsibility, for punishing you for your mother's words." Daniel looked at me for a long moment, and then he came over and he hugged me, and I realized that I couldn't remember the last time my son had voluntarily touched me. How had I let it go that long? "Mom's serious about the divorce," Daniel said, still holding me. "She told Caitlin that she'd already talked to a lawyer." I pulled back and looked at my son. "She said that. She's scared and angry, and she doesn't know how to fix this." "Neither do I admitted. "Then we better figure it out," Daniel said, "because I don't want to lose both my parents." Ellen and I talked that night, after Daniel and Caitlin had gone to bed. Really talked. Not the careful, distance-maintaining conversation we'd been having, but an actual excavation of what had happened and what it meant. She apologized. A real apology, not a performative one. She told me that she'd been dismissive of me for years, that she'd been ashamed of the way she felt about that, and that when Caitlin had said those things, it had been easy to agree because I'd already made her feel guilty about not valuing what I did and who I was. "I was trying to defend myself," she said, by agreeing that you were the problem, instead of telling her that I was the problem, that I'd let myself become someone who was embarrassed by the quietest man I know. And I apologized too, for letting my anger become a weapon, for refusing to listen, for making my hurt everyone else's responsibility. I don't know if I can fix this, I told her. I think you can, she said, but you'd have to actually try. Part 3, the real work. What happened next took a long time. This is the part of the story that doesn't have the shape of a story. There's no climactic moment, no revelation that changes everything in an instant. There's just the slow, painful work of two people who have been married 47 years deciding whether that marriage is worth saving, and if so, what it's going to take. Ellen and I went to therapy. This wasn't something we'd ever done before. It felt foreign and awkward, the way all vulnerable things feel foreign and awkward when you're the kind of people who have been trained to keep things buttoned up in private. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, and in our first session she asked us to describe our marriage in one sentence each. Ellen said, "It was built on what I wanted for us, and we never asked Prout what he wanted." I said, "It was built on work, and I forgot that work isn't the same thing as love." Dr. Chen nodded like this was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, and maybe it was. Over the course of 6 months, we unpacked a lot of things. Ellen's need to have a perfect family that looked a certain way. My willingness to be the pillar everyone leaned on without ever asking if I was tired. The ways we'd both agreed, without ever saying it out loud, that my feelings weren't as important as everyone else's comfort. We had difficult conversations. Ellen told me that she'd been attracted to me because I was steady, but that over the years, she'd come to resent that steadiness because it meant I never asked for anything. I told her that I'd been attracted to her intelligence because it made me feel less alone in my quietness, but that over the years, I'd felt increasingly like she was the one driving the relationship while I just showed up. We both admitted that we'd been married in a way that didn't require actually connecting with each other. We'd been married the way you organize a household, dividing tasks, making sure the bills got paid, keeping the structure intact. But we hadn't been married the way you're married when you really see another person. It took 3 months before Ellen and I slept in the same bed again. It took 4 months before that felt normal. It took 6 months before we could talk about Caitlin and that conversation in the kitchen without one of us getting defensive. And it took a conversation with Daniel, where I told him directly that I'd been wrong, that I'd let my hurt turn into punishment, that I was sorry for making him feel like he had to choose between his father and his fiancée, before the real healing could start. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening in January. It was just after New Year's, and we were back to the season where the earth was hard and the sky was gray. "Caitlin's pregnant," he said. I didn't know what to say to this information. I was going to be a grandfather. This was something I'd assumed would happen, but it had existed in some theoretical future. Now it was happening. "Congratulations," I said. "We'd like it if you and Mom would come to Nebraska to help when the baby comes," Daniel said. "We're going to be living in California, and it's going to be hard with just the two of us and Caitlin's parents flying in from back east." "We'll be there," I said, and I meant it. I wanted to be there. I wanted to know this child from the beginning. "And Dad," Daniel said. "Yeah. Caitlin wrote you a letter. She wanted me to ask if you'd read it." I said I would, and a few days later it arrived in the mail. The letter was careful and honest. Caitlin wrote about the things she'd said to Ellen. She said that she'd been anxious about the wedding and that she'd made comments she wasn't proud of. But she also said that she'd come to realize over the past year that I'd been hurt by those comments in ways that went deeper than the comments themselves. That there was something about being dismissed that had hit at some fundamental fear I carried. "I can't change what I said," she wrote, "but I want you to know that I see you now. I see the way your son lights up when he talks about you. I see the pride he has in everything you built. and I'm sorry for being the kind of person who doesn't see things like that without having to think about it very carefully. It wasn't a perfect letter, but it was honest, and it was enough. I wrote her back. I told her that I'd been wrong to punish her and my son for her words, that I'd let my hurt turn into something that hurt the people I loved. I told her that I was looking forward to being part of raising this child, and that I'd like to start over. That spring, Ellen and I drove to California. Daniel and Caitlin's baby, a girl named Emma, was due in April. We stayed with them for a month. I helped with the nursery, building furniture, fixing things, the language I spoke. But I also sat with Caitlin in the evenings when she was uncomfortable and couldn't sleep. I listened to her talk about her fears about motherhood, about whether she'd be good at it, about the ways her own mother had disappointed her. I saw her as a person, not as the woman who'd said cruel things about me, but as a woman who was scared and trying her best. And when Emma was born on April 15th, I held my granddaughter 30 minutes old, this tiny thing that had come from my son, and I felt something let go in me. Some bitterness I'd been carrying, some need to be right about the ways I'd been wronged. Because this child didn't care about my pride. She didn't care about what her mother's mother had said about me 2 years ago. She just needed to be held and fed and kept safe. I stayed for 2 more weeks. I helped with the overnight feeding schedule. I drove Ellen to get groceries while Daniel and Caitlin slept. I washed dishes and folded laundry and built things that needed to be built. On the day we were leaving, Daniel pulled me aside. "I think you and Mom are going to be okay," he said. "I think so too," I said. "I'm sorry for not being there for you the way a son should be," he said. "You were trying to keep your marriage intact," I said. "That was the right thing to do, and you did come looking for me eventually. That's all I needed." Before we left, Caitlin hugged me. I held on to her, this woman I'd decided to hate, and I felt the weight of how pointless that hatred had been. The next 2 years were the slow process of rebuilding something we'd let crumble. Ellen and I traveled together. We took a trip to Italy that she'd wanted to take for decades. We went to Yellowstone and hiked trails and slept under stars. We didn't solve everything. There were still moments when she'd say something that made me feel invisible, or I'd be so quiet that she'd think I was angry when I was just thinking. But we were trying, we were seeing each other. I became the kind of grandfather who shows up, who takes Emma for weekends when Daniel and Caitlin needed a break, who taught her to hammer nails into wood, who built her a treehouse, who told her stories about when her father was small. And with Daniel, I built something new, something different. We didn't have the same language, him and me, but we learned to speak to each other anyway. We'd talk on the phone every Sunday. He'd ask about my work. I'd ask about his. We'd talk about Emma, about the way she was growing, about what kind of person she seemed to be becoming. I stopped expecting him to be someone he wasn't, and I think he stopped expecting me to be smaller than I actually was. The night before Emma's 5th birthday party, I had a conversation with my wife that felt like a small resolution. We were lying in bed, the same bed we'd shared for 47 years, that we'd stopped sharing for a while, that we'd come back to, and Ellen was reading. I was just lying there thinking about my granddaughter, about how 5 years had passed, about how much had changed. I was thinking about what Caitlin said, Ellen said, not looking up from her book, about having to manage you at events. "Don't do this," I said. "No, I mean it." I was thinking about how cruel that was and how right she was, and how much I hate both of those things being true. I was quiet for a moment, and then I said, "I wasn't awkward. I just didn't belong, and you were all anxious about me knowing it." "That's not fair," Ellen said. She put her book down. "It was fair, actually. It was fair and mean and true. We were all anxious about you knowing you didn't belong because you'd already known it your whole life and we'd never bothered to fix it." "You can't fix something like that," I said. "It gets into you too deep." "No," Ellen agreed. "But you can build something different. You can build a space where someone does belong." I thought about Emma. I thought about the way she reached for me, the way she trusted me, the way she asked me questions about how things worked and actually listened to the answers. I think we did, I said. With her, I think we did it right with her. Ellen reached over and took my hand, and we lay like that for a while in the dark, holding onto each other in the way that people do when they're neither young nor perfect, but they're trying. Epilogue, the long view. I'm 74 now. It's been 5 years since that Tuesday in March when I overheard a conversation in my son's kitchen that changed everything. And I want to tell you what I've learned in those 5 years, not as wisdom. I'm not wise, but as something I've paid for with actual years of my life. I've learned that being right is not the same as being happy, that a man can be absolutely correct about the ways he's been wronged and still be miserable. That vindication is a very small prize compared to connection. I've learned that my wife is not responsible for the fact that I was invisible as a child, but I was also right to ask her not to perpetuate that invisibility as an adult. I've learned that my son is going to make different choices than I would make, and that that's okay, that I can love him and not understand him, that this is, in fact, what most of love actually is. I've learned that Caitlin is a good woman trying her best, the same way I'm a good man trying his best, and that sometimes that's all you get. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means deciding that the future matters more than the past. It means walking forward with your people even when they've hurt you, because the alternative, walking forward alone, is a much lonelier thing. Emma's birthday party this year is at a park. She's 10 now. She's invited 16 kids from school and their parents. The table is chaos. There's food everywhere, and kids are running around with frosting on their faces, and someone has forgotten napkins, which seems like a significant oversight. Ellen is helping to manage it. Caitlin is trying to keep some semblance of order. Daniel is grilling hot dogs. And I'm sitting at a picnic table with my granddaughter and her best friend, and we're building something out of sticks and leaves. Grandpa, Emma says, is this architecture? It's something, I say. My mom says architecture is when you plan something before you build it, but we're just building. Then I guess this is just building, I say. But it's still good, right? Emma asks, looking up at me. And I can see it so clearly in that moment. The thing that Caitlin said about me 5 years ago, that I was awkward, that I needed to be managed, that I didn't know how to fit into events. And I can also see that it doesn't matter anymore. Because this child, this bright, curious, brave child, doesn't think I'm awkward. She thinks I'm someone who knows how to build things. She thinks I'm someone who can help her make something out of sticks and leaves. It's good, I tell her. It's very good. And I mean it in a way that goes deeper than just what she's building. I mean it about the moment. I mean it about the fact that I'm here and I'm seen and I belong. People sometimes ask me if I regret the year I spent angry, and the honest answer is no, but not for the reasons you might think. I regret the year because I hurt people I loved, but I don't regret it because it taught me something essential, that I'd spent my entire life before that year in a kind of sleep. That I'd been invisible so long that I'd stopped expecting to be seen. That year when I refused to disappear, when I said no to being managed and dismissed, that year woke me up. It was painful and it was ugly and it damaged things, but it also forced me to ask for what I needed, and it forced the people I loved to actually see me. Sometimes that's what it takes. I want to say something directly to you, whoever you are reading this. If you're the person who's been invisible in your own family, who's been the quiet one, the one who shows up and does the work but never quite belongs, you have a choice. You can keep being quiet, you can keep showing up, you can keep building things and never asking to be seen. It's a safe choice. It won't rock the boat. It will keep your family stable, at least on the surface. Or you can ask for what you need. You can risk the peace that's built on your silence. You can say no to being managed and dismissed. You can do this awkwardly and imperfectly and painfully, You might break some things that you spent decades building. But you might also, if you're very lucky and you do it right, end up with the thing that matters more than peace, which is actually being part of your own family. It took me 72 years to learn this. I'm telling you in case it takes you less time. The last thing I want to say is this. I didn't get revenge. That's what the title of this story suggests I decided to do. It suggests that I'm telling you about the years I spent making them regret what they did to me. That's what I thought I wanted, that night when I left my son's house with the knowledge that I was going to be excluded from his wedding. But revenge is something that lives in you. It doesn't hurt the people you're angry at, it just keeps you company in the dark. The thing that actually healed me wasn't revenge. It was being useful. It was being needed. It was my granddaughter asking me how to build something and actually listening to the answer. It was my son coming back to me, even when I was being unreasonable. It was my wife finally seeing me, even though it took her years of grief to get there. It was the slow, boring, unglamorous work of showing up, of trying again, of deciding that the people I loved were worth more than my pride. I'm 74 years old. I have maybe 10, maybe 15 good years left if I'm lucky. And I'm not going to spend them being angry about a conversation I overheard in a kitchen 5 years ago. I'm going to spend them watching my granddaughter grow. I'm going to spend them with my wife. I'm going to spend them building things, teaching things, being the person that my family reaches for. That's the revenge, if you want to call it that. It's the revenge of actually living, instead of just existing in the margins of someone else's life. And it's better than anything else I could have chosen. My name is Prute Taylor Vince. I'm 74 years old. And for the first time in my life, I think I finally belong.